Hello, everybody, of who might be here. Doesn't say that I have any viewers. Oh, it shows I have one. Oh my God. I'm rich. I'm famous. I'm comfortably well off. Uh, hello, Pat. He says in the chat, to be fair, coherence has never been Jill's strong suit. Yeah, I responded to that with, yeah, it's true. So yesterday, I did a very long stream, which I haven't done in a while, and normally I wasn't going to cover anything from Jill, but that one was funny. I enjoyed that. Um, and then today I was like, okay, I'm probably not going to respond to any more of Jill. But that at least that's what I was thinking. And then I was like, well, let's see what he comes back with. Let's see what he does. There is some other stuff that I'm going to cover later, probably not in this video. I might just keep this one short and then move on to something else in a separate video. So with that being said, I'm just going to move right into this. I read some of these comment threads or some of these comments from yesterday. I think I read maybe a couple, but I had already been on for 6 hours, so I didn't really go too much into it. I mean, think about it. It's a 6-hour stream. Most people don't watch 6-hour streams all the way through, not unless they. I mean, I have to. 6-hour streams are a lot to get through, right? Yeah, long is an understatement. Yeah, it was like praise. That was like praise long. Um, and that was just me and Wildheart, and then um, what's his name showed up. Yeah, who's that guy? Who's that guy? Always pretending, always wanting to pretend to be Jill. Rebuke and reprove. Oh yeah, Peter DeTucker. He showed up around the 4-hour mark, or close to the 4-hour mark. We talked and everything, but a lot of that was just commentary for me. Was just going over the ridiculousness of. It was 58 minutes. It was amazing how much you can sit there and you can pull from that. But I spent a lot of time reading from different sources and stuff like that. Well, probably about maybe four readings in there, I think, spaced in there somewhere, plus some Bible verses that I read, shit like that. So yeah, long. Might have to break that one down. Yeah, I'd use words like marathon or Herculean. Yeah, I think I may have developed some clots in my calves from that one, Pat. So yeah, this one, no, not going to be as long. Like I said, probably going to split this up. This other video that I might be doing after this one would be in response to another Christian who's doing videos on YouTube where he does seem to have a problem with claims of the Old Testament or the Bible endorsing slavery, and his reading comprehension seems to be as bad, if not maybe worse than Jill's, if that's even possible. I don't think the guy is as much of a, well, for lack of a better term, jerk, but he doesn't. He seems to have a real dislike for anyone who's a non-believer, especially atheists. A lot of his videos are focused on atheists being liars and how atheists are basically just, assholes. But I don't think he ever uses the word asshole, even though his air seems to come off that way. But his videos aren't very long. It's pretty easy to point out some of the flaws in his shit, but like I said, that's coming later. So with this, this is the comment thread from the video that Jill did, where Jill was, he recorded his conversation with Wildheart. And this is exactly what I was reviewing. This is the video that I was reviewing yesterday. So some funny ones in here. Cygnus Eustace, he's a non-believer as well. He likes to really, he gets under Jill's skin. The quickest way to get a Christian to lie is to ask them about slavery in the Bible. He says chattel slaves could be captured from enemy non-combatants in which the Israelites were the aggressors, or they could be purchased without regards to provenance, or they could be born into lifelong slavery. None of this was voluntary. None of this was for the economic benefit of the slave. I don't necessarily disagree, but I'm thinking some, at least in the sense of the indentured servitude part, if we consider that slavery, which we do today, that kind of slavery was voluntary when it came to Israelites selling themselves to other Israelites. And they could voluntarily sell their children, as payment for debt. Obviously, that's a problem because while the transaction, like Jill was talking about that the other day on his channel, where he's talking about, was there any kind of like forced transaction here, right? And it's like, well, let's think about this carefully. And another way of looking at that is the transaction of if somebody's in debt and they sell their kid off in payment of a debt, right? Does the kid really have a choice? No, they don't. So the kid is being forced to basically be collateral on, or either collateral or being payment for a debt, right? That kid becomes pledged to this other person or whatever until the debt is paid off, especially if it was like an Israelite, probably in the case of like if it was an Israelite kid. So you have that, but there's the force when it comes to the kid. Is it, and that person really has really no choice because, well, they took a loan, they don't have the money to pay it back, so they use their kid to basically, pay it off. Sell their kid, boop, they can clear their debt, and then maybe the kid works for so long because they're an Israelite, and then they come back, right? Because the kid, if the kid is an Israelite or the child of an Israelite, I think the male rules for that young male would still apply as to like an adult male, right? They would only serve for 6 and go out on the 7th. Unfortunately, at least according to Exodus 21, an Amah, if it was his daughter, if it was the man's daughter, no, she does not get to go out like the males do, according to Exodus 21. But so there's that force that you see is the force in the person who's being used as payment of the debt or for the debt. Jill seemed to think that, well, you'd have to have the forced transaction on the person using someone else to pay for a debt, then it counts as slavery or something like that. It's ridiculous, but either way. So Jill responds with, where you been, chat rat? See me in debate if you disagree. That way you have to actually articulate exactly what your counter argument is. You're wrong, and your wrong is never an argument. Pick the day and the time, liberal. You will get the same lesson Wildheart got. Chattel slaves are not mentioned in this entire chapter, as I demonstrated here. Chattel slaves do not become rich, dummy. Yeah, nobody said that chattel slaves can become rich. And chattel slaves are mentioned in Leviticus 25, considering the fact that they are referred to as Akuzah. But when it comes to the foreign slaves, Cygnus Eustace, see me and debate if you disagree, so you can run away again. Then that way you can actually articulate exactly what your counter argument is. Then Cygnus Eustace is replying point by point here. I can defend all my claims. Child, pick one. That's one of the things that Cygnus Eustace likes to call Jill child, because Jill is kind of childish. Chattel slaves could be captured from enemy non-combatants in which the Israelites were the aggressors. Chattel slaves could be purchased without regards to provenance. Chattel slaves could be born into lifelong slavery. And yeah. Chattel slaves are not mentioned in this entire chapter, as I demonstrated here. Just another one of your lies. Chattel slavery is defined as the enslaving and owning of human beings as their offspring as property, able to be bought and sold and forced to work. Another definition is the condition in which a person is owned as property by another and is under the owner's control, especially in involuntary servitude. Leviticus 25 explicitly describes and condones chattel slavery. 44, both thy bindmen and thy bondmaids. He uses fucking Jesus. Using King James. Ugh, I hate King James. Let's skip that. So then Rebuke and Reprove, or Jill, comes back with, his typical, because you're too dumb to first read the passage you're trying to critique. In the passage, the foreigners become rich and start buying their own slaves, some even Israelite slaves, Leviticus 25:47. If this is a chattel slave genius, how does that occur? Who said that the foreigner was a chattel slave? Or at any time was a foreign, was a chattel slave? The foreigner, the Toshav. Because I think that's where Jill keeps screwing that up. Like there's this thing set in their head, and it's set in Praise's head too, that there's this idea that all the foreigners, any foreigners living amongst the Israelites were relegated to slavery, or could just be, were either just default chattel slaves, or could be relegated to chattel slavery, you know, like on a whim kind of thing. And it's like, I don't know if that's what they're thinking. I don't know where they get that from. But it's a very easy way. There's an easy way to answer the question. The foreigner who has become rich amongst the Israelites, who the Israelite sells himself into indentured servitude to, is a foreigner who became rich. They were never a slave. They were not a slave. I shouldn't say they were never a slave. Maybe there's the possibility that the tenant farmer or the Teshav was from another area. He was from he was a slave in another nation. He was freed. I'm just giving probably a rare hypothetical. He was freed. He can leave. He goes to Israel and he decides to just reside with the Israelites. And he basically works as a tenant farmer. He even adopts their beliefs, becomes circumcised so he can partake in their ceremonies, right? Their rituals, their religious practices and feasts and stuff. Does all of that. But he would never be considered a native-born Israelite. He would be still a Teshav. He's integrated into that society. He can't really own land, at least not in any real way, at least according to them, because anybody who owned land after when the Jubilee hit, everything kind of reset, went back to the ancestral setup that it was before, I guess. Either way. But yeah, he's now working as a tenant farmer. He's making some money. He's become rich. Now you have a destitute Israelite. That Israelite sells himself to Shav as a way of paying off debt, but it's an indentured servitude agreement, which it goes into later on in Leviticus 25. It says exactly what happens. But yeah, that Teshav, not a slave. Could it maybe could have been a slave from somewhere else and was released, but in Israel, no, not a slave. And that goes for any Teshav. So this idea that the foreigners are just default slaves, no. I don't know where they're getting it from. So then I wrote, look, it looks like you've adopted praises. Look, see how the foreigner can become rich in Leviticus 25:47? That debunks the biblical slavery right there. And then I said, it's a horn light of reasoning. And then he responded to me and said, glad you couldn't say how much was bad reasoning, which means you have none. Just arguing for the sake of arguing. Go back to your echo chamber, silly atheist. Well, I just gave, I don't know if Jill's paying attention or if he will even watch this, but I just gave the line of reasoning just a little bit ago. And then he says, go back to your echo chamber, you silly atheist. Do as your custom and erase your comments after utterly being defeated. Now he's just being petty and petulant. I said, oh, I have a line of reasoning, but I was hoping that would prompt you to show me why you think it's a good line of reasoning that if a sojourner could become rich living among the Israelites, then it follows that no sojourner could have been slaves, or it's impossible for them to have become slaves. And then he says, again, complaining to the fact that people break laws as evidence that the law doesn't exist as another poor rational argument. I don't know what he really means there. Like, is he saying that people actually broke the law and made sojourners slaves? And that was against the law? That's not what I was asking. What I'm asking is why you guys think it was impossible. Because there's nothing in Leviticus 25 that says it's impossible for a foreigner to become a slave. But there's nothing saying that it's impossible for a foreigner to become rich either. Right? Because it's about status. It's about a foreigner entering into the status of slavery. Not that all foreigners are necessarily slaves and that they default to slavery, and then for somehow or another there's a contradiction there that the slaves can become rich. He says that is all proof we need to suggest God does not sanction the behavior. See, there's no law that says don't do it. He hasn't even pointed to a law that says don't do it. But the only thing that he did when he was talking with Wildheart was try to say that slavery just meant borrower. And earlier in the video said borrowing was basically if you, or being a slave was somebody who was being charged interest on a loan. It's really bad apologetics. I got some comments here from here. The interesting thing is that Jill is more than willing to do at the drop of a hat when it serves his motivations, jumping from chapter to chapter, book to book, a dishonest POS. Yep, agreed. Jill's most understanding of history and the socio-cultural norms of the ancient Levant is astonishing. It's like watching a child playing with explosives. Jill also equating the Bible with God, it seems. Yeah. Let me put an invite out in case any of you guys want to join. I know people are working, but I'll throw the invite out anyway. If you can't join, don't worry about it. Like I said, this one's not going to be very long. If I spend an hour on this, maybe hour and a half, that's cool. But like I said, I'm going to probably jump to another video. I was going to do it all as one, but then I was like, nah, let's split it. So oh yeah, defy God's prescriptions or will. Game over, Jay. Dance law. He's declaring victory already. Hey kid, have you learned that the Bible or a win? Hey kid, have you learned that the Bible does not say that slaves can become rich yet? Are you done with that lie? And then I wrote, when did I write anything about breaking laws and how was I meant to write how was I conflating again? Or how was there any conflation? Anyway. Then Jill responds to Cygnus Eustace, hey kid, go read the verse or watch the video. The same word is used in verse 47 as in verse 44. This is why you lose every debate. Which word is he referring to? Answer the question, don't avoid. 3 verses later, the same slave that came from the other nations is now rich. No one said anything. There's no verse that says that a slave from another nation became rich. How did he do that? The same word is used in verse 47 as in verse 44. This is why you lose every debate. Answer the question, don't avoid. 3 verses later, in the same slaves that came from other nations is now rich. How did that happen? It doesn't say that the same slaves from other nations became rich. Let's look at Leviticus 25. So yeah, if anything, Jill is demonstrating, keeps demonstrating how he's illiterate here. I'm going to go to this tab. Oops, wrong one. Let's just go down to 39. If any of you are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. They and their children with them shall go out from your authority. They shall go back to their own family and return to their ancestral property. So that's referring to Israelites. For there are many servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God. Then it says here, as for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you and from their families who are with you, who have been born in your land. They may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the others with harshness. Now, right there, where it says, these you may treat as slaves, it's not referring to all foreigners. If that's what Jill and Praise are thinking, and that's what he thinks that atheists are thinking or non-believers are thinking, that's not what that means. And if I'm telling you, any non-believer or skeptic or whatever that thinks that that's what that means, you're wrong. All it's referring to is that there are some there. It's God basically saying, look, if you want male and female slaves that you can basically hold as possessions. You don't ever have to give them up, right? If you don't want to, you can hold on to them. You can go to the other nations around you and you can get those male and female slaves from them, or you can get them from the foreigners that are residing among you, right? So if a foreigner decides to sell himself to you, or however that works, or a foreigner is forced into slavery or something, I don't know. They do something and that now they can be sold as a slave. I don't know. Or they just sell their children to you. Those foreigners living amongst you. So it's the problem here is that the foreigners that are living amongst the Israelites are not default slaves. It's the fact that they could become slaves. If they were to be bought as slaves, if they sold their children to you as a slave, then this applies. They're foreigners. Those, once they enter into a status of slavery, they do not go free. They are akuzah. They become property. They are your possession. You can pass them down to your family. I don't know why Jill and Praise have such a hard time with this. And then when it goes into 47, if the resident aliens among you prosper, right? So if resident aliens, it doesn't say if a slave prospers, it's talking about a resident alien prospering. So again, a resident alien isn't by default a slave. So whatever this straw man is that you've developed, or maybe you've had some conversations with some people that didn't really know what they were talking about when they were criticizing these, that's not my position in any way, shape, or form. There's the status of slavery stays as a status of slavery that can happen if Israelites purchase foreigners. In this case, the slavery where that is like almost like landed property, but not with Israelites. Israelites, it's indentured servitude, and it's for a particular period of time. By Jill's juvenile mentality and authoritarian sympathies, I guess I'm a slave to American Express. What if I pay my full balance off each month? Have I been manumitted, redeemed? Good question. I don't know. So he wrote to me. This is when I think this is pretty much tells me that I've gotten under his skin. Still running, ducking, and hiding must suck being a liberal. I'm glad you didn't burn alive out there in your state run by dead brain Saudis. Again, how did the foreigner, resident alien in verse 44, he became rich in verse 47? Is that all you got, liberal? Praise uses this argument. Praise can fucking read? That's your counter argument? Praise can read, but myself and Dr. Josh cannot? It's no wonder your city is burning down. The same question will be asked until it is answered. Or you can take your comment feed home, liberal, and burden along with the rest of your illogical, dumb ideas that God has forsaken cesspool you call a city. I have enough views. Thanks. I don't even know what he's asking me. And if he's asking me the same question, how does the resident alien become rich? Very easy. They're working as a tenant farmer, doing some kind of trade with the Israelites, and it's paying off well for them. They're not default slaves. There's nothing in the Bible that says that the resident aliens, that the sojourners, could not become wealthy living amongst the Israelites. They're not de facto slaves, Jill. So let me go here again, and then I'll probably end this. Objection 3. Slaves could become rich. This is from Dr. Josh BOOOOWEN from Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? Second edition. Doesn't Leviticus 25, 47 through 45 show that the tenant foreigner, Hebrew Tushav, that became a slave in verse 45 now becomes very wealthy? Doesn't that mean that slaves could become very wealthy and therefore not really slaves as we understand the term? They were never slaves. They were probably never slaves, or just not slaves when they entered Israel. They're foreigners. They're a sojourner. They have not entered into a status of slavery. Do you think that, wait, I wonder if this comes from the idea that the only foreigners that would have been in Israel would have been the foreigners that the Israelites captured. I wonder if that's what they're getting confused. Like when the Israelites took out a foreign nation and then they took those people in, they were automatically slaves. So they're kind of conflating, they're kind of confusing that. Maybe that's where that's coming from. It's like, no, a lot of different, probably based on the Israelites, says anybody else who's not an Israelite is a foreigner. So depending on how many nation states or tribes or whatever that are around that area, that's a lot of neighbors. That's a lot of different foreigners. So, and if I recall, who are the ones? Maybe Pat can answer this one. I could look it up real quick. There was the group that the Israelites warned to get out of the territory where the Amalekites were at because Saul was coming to kill all the Amalekites. That would be whatever that group is called. I'm blanking on the name of that particular group of foreigners. That would be an example of like foreigners who were in good relations with the Israelites. They could probably live amongst the Israelites. Some of them could go and reside amongst the Israelites, become tenant farmers, and possibly become rich. This doesn't mean that they were necessarily default or de facto slaves. Yeah, and I'm being very charitable because there's that whole distinction. There's that kind of that distinction between the ger and the Teshav. I think if I remember correctly, like Teshav is a little bit more integrated. They're not just kind of moving along with them. The Teshav is kind of like embedded themselves in with the Israelites. They can even like they can even adopt the religious practices of the Jews, get circumcised, partake in all that kind of stuff. They can have slaves and they have to circumcise their slaves if they want to partake in any of these kind of things, shit like that. And I think it goes even for Gers too. But with the Teshavs, it's more like they're more at home with the Israelites. They're not just traveling along with them. And then either way, it still doesn't change the fact they're not native born. So, and living among the Israelites versus those who are simply passing through for travel and or trade. Yeah, exactly. So let me go back to read this and then I'll be done. As we have seen, Leviticus 25 contains stipulations for the redemption of property by the individual or by their family members in order that the Israelites could not become destitute and have their land end up in the hands of only a few wealthy in the nation. Every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, property and people were to be returned and all debts of Israelites were to be forgiven. However, this left open the question of a poor Israelite who sold himself to a foreigner who had means enough to purchase him. In this case, the Tashav, tenant foreigner, had become wealthy enough to lend money to Israelite who could no longer pay it back and had therefore sold himself into debt slavery. A relative of the Israelite was to redeem him back from the foreigner. So again, this is the tenant foreigner residing amongst the Israelites, right? He owes that tenant farmer money. his fellow Israelites should purchase him back. The question is, who is the tenant foreigner? Teshav. The apologetic argument focuses on the fact that in Leviticus 25:45, the word appears as a group from which the Israelites might legally purchase slaves. The rationale is that if one of these enslaved tenant foreigners, Teshav, can become wealthy enough to be able to afford to purchase his own slaves, then how can they be actual slaves? Slaves can't amass wealth like that. The problem is not in the language, but in the logic of the passage. Leviticus 25:44 through 46 stipulates who can be taken as proper slaves by the Israelites. They could purchase slaves from the nations around them, verse 44, and they could also purchase slaves from a group of people living in the land of Israel, the tenant foreigners, Toshav, amongst others. Thus, this text is picturing a group of people living in Israel who are renting out land from the Israelites. Because foreigners were not allowed to own property in the land of Israel, these tenant farmers had to pay the Israelite landowners the use or portion of their property. This situation could go one or at least two ways. First, the tenant farmer could fail to grow enough to produce and make enough money to pay off their rent and any debt that was owed to the Israelite or perhaps someone else to whom they had become indebted. In this case, it may have become necessary for the tenant farmer to sell himself into slavery to pay off a debt or perhaps simply to receive basic living requirements and to survive. In this case, the law allowed the Israelites to take these foreigners as proper slaves. Another possibility, however, would be that the tenant farmer working the land and that they were renting from an Israelite would do well. They could have good crop years, sell large amounts of produce, and make a lot of money. Now, bear in mind that they would basically be making good money, and then who they're renting that property, they're the tenant farmer working the land that's owned by an Israelite. That Israelite gets a cut of that profit as well, if I understand that correctly. It's kind of like sharecropping. If I'm not wrong, Pat, you can correct me if I'm fucked up. Either way, um, they could have a good crop year and sell large amounts of produce and make a lot of money. This would be a successful tenant farmer to shove. In this case, the foreigner might even become wealthy enough to make loans to other Israelites or even purchase poor Israelites who were selling themselves into slavery. This is where Leviticus 25:47 through 55 comes in. The law has laid out that what is supposed to happen if an Israelite sells himself to another Israelite as a slave, but yeah, okay. The law has laid out what is supposed to happen if an Israelite sells himself to another Israelite as a slave. But what if the Israelite sells himself to a tenant farmer? In other words, the tenant foreigner, Teshav, in verse 45, is not the same person that is spoken about in the beginning in verse 47. There was a group of tenant foreigners, some of them who could become poor, verses 44 through 46, and some who could become wealthy, verses 47 through 55. In short, this passage makes it clear that not all foreigners in the land of Israel were destitute or had to become slaves to the Israelites. Indeed, some of them had wealth and at times greater wealth than some members of the Israelite citizenry. There neither negates the existence of foreign slaves nor the laws concerning foreign slaves seen just a few verses earlier. It only indicates that tenant foreigners could establish wealth in the land, which is in no way unexpected. So, not a problem. I still don't know why Jill has a problem, or even Praise has a problem really understanding the endorsement of slavery in this. And again, I don't know of a lot of people who have deconstructed from Christianity where the endorsement of slavery was really the crux of their, or like the straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing that really led them out of Christianity. But then again, I could be wrong. I know in my deconstruction from Christianity, this wasn't it. This was just like, oh, well, that's interesting. I never even thought about it that way. But there you go. Hey, Slim Jim, good to see you. With that, I think I'm going to end this. I'm at the 35-minute mark. I've done what I've wanted to do, which is respond to Jill and his goofiness on the comment thread, and then reiterate these points since he seems to be having a hard time reading and really understanding. Jill gets like that. He kind of gets stuck in his own bullshit and he can't get his way out. But anybody who's ever had any long conversations with Jill kind of understands that. But anyway, I'm done. I'm going to take about 30 minutes or so, and then I'm going to set up another video. So see you later.